Hello and welcome to In Focus. Today we will talk about how Ukraine strengthens its position in Europe, with Serbia backing Kyiv's path toward EU membership and expanding economic and energy cooperation. And Russia faces another setback in the post-Soviet space, as Armenia continues to move away from Moscow and deepen ties with the West. Ukraine is expanding its network of partners far beyond the traditional European framework. During President Volodymyr Zelensky's first official visit to Serbia, Kyiv and Belgrade moved to deepen cooperation in trade, energy, infrastructure, and European integration.
This is President Volodymyr Zelensky's first official visit to Belgrade. The Ukrainian and Serbian leaders have met several times before at international forums and summits abroad. During the visit, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding between Ukraine's State Service for Food Safety and Consumer Protection and Serbia's Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Water Management. The talks between Volodymyr Zelensky and Aleksandar Vučić focused on strengthening bilateral cooperation. The Ukrainian president thanked Serbia for a new package of assistance in healthcare and energy, as well as for its readiness to help rebuild one of the Ukrainian cities affected by Russian aggression.
There are specific infrastructure and reconstruction projects in Ukraine that we can implement together. This will be important for preserving and creating new, decent jobs in both Ukraine and Serbia. We also discussed cooperation in food security. We talked about the challenges Ukraine will face this winter, when virtually none of our thermal power plants remain intact because of Russian strikes, with Russian missiles deliberately targeting infrastructure to make life unbearable for Ukrainians. All our energy cooperation projects with partners are extremely important. It is crucial that there are ways to strengthen energy cooperation between our countries.
Ukraine and Serbia plan to conclude a free trade agreement by the end of 2026. Aleksandar Vučić noted the growth in trade between the two countries. In 2025, bilateral trade exceeded $442 million, while in the first half of 2026, it reached almost $346 million. Belgrade expressed its readiness to involve Ukrainian companies in national infrastructure projects and in the post-war period to establish joint exports of goods to markets in Asia and Africa.
For us, it is important not only to import iron ore and soybeans while exporting sunflower seeds and baby food, but to maximize and further expand this cooperation. Our teams have a lot of work ahead of them to accelerate the conclusion of the free trade agreement between Ukraine and Serbia. These negotiations are moving forward, which is encouraging. It would be good to prepare everything necessary by the end of this year to conclude the free trade agreement between Ukraine and Serbia.
Belgrade adheres to the UN Charter and UN resolutions and respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, Aleksandar Vučić stressed. Serbia also supports Ukraine on its path toward EU membership.
We discussed the European path of both Serbia and Ukraine. As for Ukraine, it will always have our support on its path to the EU. We want Ukraine to open all the negotiating clusters as soon as possible and close them as soon as possible, because that is the wish of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership. As for Serbia, we have not had and will not have any problems with this in the future. On the contrary, we will do everything in our power to help Ukraine on its European path.
For his part, Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv would welcome faster progress on Serbia's European integration. Serbia has held EU candidate status since 2012. However, Vučić said he does not see a possibility for Serbia to join the EU in the near future, citing political reasons. During the visit, Volodymyr Zelensky also met with Serbian Prime Minister Đuro Maček. One of the central issues was Ukraine's preparations for the winter. The two sides agreed to step up cooperation to support Ukraine's energy system, with Belgrade allocating €2 million for this purpose. They also discussed joint logistics projects in detail, with particular attention to the development of the Danube corridor and strengthening links between Ukraine, the Western Balkans, and the European Union. Reported by Victoria Chistiukina, UATV News.
Meanwhile, Moscow is struggling to preserve its influence in another former Soviet republic. Armenia is building new partnerships with the United States, the European Union, and other countries, while making it increasingly clear that its foreign policy will not be dictated from the Kremlin.
Moscow is once again warning Armenia of political instability, inflation, and rising prices. This time, the latest threats came from Russian Security Council Deputy Chairman Dmitry Medvedev. At a press conference, he claimed that breaking ties with Moscow would have fatal consequences for the Armenian economy, while the West, he said, would do nothing to help Yerevan. This comes after Russia itself launched a trade war against Armenia several months ago. The Kremlin banned imports of Armenian vegetables and fruit, flowers, brandy, mineral water, and dairy products.
The problem is that Armenia has decided to have alternatives. Previously, Armenia had no alternatives, either economically or politically. Now, Armenia has signed strategic partnership documents with China, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, France, and many other countries. Russia sees this policy as a problem because it believes that partnership relations should be exclusive. We do not share this approach, and this is a perfectly understandable and entirely legitimate position.
Back in February 2024, Armenia effectively froze its membership in the Collective Security Treaty Organization by refusing to participate in the organization's activities at any level. At the same time, Yerevan began rapidly moving closer to the European Union. In May 2026, Armenia hosted the first-ever bilateral Armenia-EU summit, while the country received 30 million euros in assistance from the European Peace Facility. The sides also agreed to strengthen cooperation in security and border management. For the Kremlin, Yerevan's pivot has become an obvious challenge. As the Wall Street Journal notes, Putin is watching the system of influence over the post-Soviet space that he spent years trying to maintain steadily unravel.
Russia is finally losing its geopolitical influence across the post-Soviet space, while its concept of the so-called near abroad has completely failed because of the war against Ukraine. All former Soviet republics, with the exception of its one remaining satellite, are trying to distance themselves from Moscow as much as possible, even after open Kremlin threats to use the Ukrainian scenario against Yerevan. The Armenian authorities have not backed down, demonstrating their full independence from Moscow. Casey Mickle, columnist, in a column for the Wall Street Journal.
Moscow has repeatedly demanded that the Armenian authorities hold a referendum as soon as possible on choosing between the Eurasian Economic Union and the European Union. But according to Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, there are currently no grounds for such a vote. First, clear European integration processes must be launched, and only then should citizens be asked to make a choice. Speaking at a meeting of the Eurasian Intergovernmental Council in Kyrgyzstan, Pashinyan once again made it clear that Yerevan would make this decision independently, rather than at the Kremlin's direction.
Невозможно этот вопрос вывести на решение граждан Армении.
It is impossible to put this issue to the citizens of Armenia without first carrying out the necessary institutional and preparatory work. Even after that, it would be necessary to submit an official application to the European Union for membership. Then, it would be necessary to obtain candidate status for EU membership. Without completing at least a substantial part of these stages, holding a referendum on this issue would be meaningless. And what we expect from our citizens is an answer to a question that, as of today, simply does not exist.
Armenia is now systematically expanding its ties with a growing number of countries. For example, in July, Yerevan signed a charter on a comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States. And just days ago, Kyiv and Yerevan agreed to increase by 30% the quota of universal permits for international road freight transport. The European Union, meanwhile, has pledged 50 million euros to Armenia amid Russia's trade restrictions. This is only the beginning. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, "The assistance package includes easier trade conditions for a range of Armenian goods, particularly agricultural products. And the more pressure Moscow puts on Yerevan, the more actively Armenia strengthens its ties with the West." Reported by Irina Yusupova, UATV News.
From the Balkans to the South Caucasus, the regional balance is shifting, and Moscow is finding it increasingly difficult to preserve the influence it once took for granted. As Ukraine strengthens its international partnerships and Russia faces growing resistance from former partners, the Kremlin's ability to shape events beyond its borders continues to decline. If you enjoyed this episode, consider putting a like on this video and subscribe to our channel. We will see you in the next one.